The Johnson Wax Program with Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly.
We interrupt this program for a special news bulletin.
The day of infamy changed America. America's boys were over there again, leaving behind loved ones to wait and wonder if their sons, brothers, husbands were coming home again. A time of great stress and anxiety. Even our entertainment was questioned.
Voices in and out of radio were seriously questioning whether comedy programs shouldn't be silenced for the duration of the war. Levity was inappropriate and in bad taste in the face of death and destruction flowing from participation in a world war.
And there was a call to silence comedians.
Oh, yeah? Well, they can't do this to me.
Thankfully, saner minds prevailed. On December 9, 2 days after Pearl Harbor, Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly, with the blessings of their sponsor, were advocating for responsible levity.
We have just received this message for our listeners in a telegram from the president of S.C. Johnson & Son, Incorporated, our sponsor. In these serious days, there can be no division of opinion. The United States is at war, and we are all ready and eager to do our part. The makers of Johnson's Wax and Glow Coat believe it is in the public interest to continue programs as entertaining as Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly. They have a place in national morale. So you can continue to hear Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly and still be in touch with latest developments. We have asked the National Broadcasting Company to feel free at any time to cut into our programs with important news flashes and announcements. Signed, H.F. Johnson, Jr.
And so Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly went to war. Countless episodes had fun with a serious and sobering subject: the work and sacrifice of the civilian population. Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly's attitude was simple: we can get through this. It has been said that no other entertainers did more for the home front than Abbott and Costello. Indeed, their efforts at selling war bonds are legendary. But it can also be said that right behind them were Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly. In fact, they received accolades from all points of the home front, including this one from the Catholic War veterans, whose award summed up Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly's contribution.
In recognition of their successful efforts to lighten the burdens of the American people in a time of great ordeal through understanding and clean comedy.
Radio Guide magazine, at the end of the war, noted,
Pagliaccis of the air who were trying their darndest to make America forget its troubles.
And years later, Arthur Frank Wertheim, in radio comedy, observed,
Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly was an institution that upheld national morale during two critical events, the Great Depression and World War II.
Just what we need at times of stress and anxiety.
Ain't funny, McGee.
The Johnson Wax Program with Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly.
There is probably no address more familiar to radio audiences, next to 221B Baker Street, of course, than 79 Wistful Vista. This was the residence of Fibber, Mcgee, an eccentric know-it-all, and his wife of many years, Molly. Mcgee viewed himself as an authority on everything. His wife viewed him as a lovable, if outspoken and opinionated dreamer. His neighbors and friends saw him as an eccentric screwball. The Mcgees were played by a married couple, Jim and Marion Jordan, who, with writer Don Quinn, created a program that intentionally or not was unlike any other comedy show. Other comedy programs were usually dominated by a personality, such as Jack Benny, Bob Hope, and Red Skelton, and these shows were often made up of separate segments, such as chit-chat with guest stars, a musical number or two, and comedy sketches. Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly, however, presented a show that was all one piece. It was a simple format. The show was set nearly always in the Mcgee living room at 79 Wistful Vista in the community of Wistful Vista. That was not too far away from Peoria. Incidentally, the only other location mentioned was 14th and Oak. Any incident mentioned outside of 79 Wistful Vista always occurred at the corner of 14th and Oak. The Mcgee living room was just a typical American living room, but apparently with just two doors, the front door through which their neighbors and friends entered, and the closet door. More about that door later. The narrative followed a formulaic structure that sustained the series throughout its roughly 20-year run. First was an introduction and first commercial. Then the announcer set the scene, the first act in which the situation was presented, and this was interrupted by a musical number. The second act followed after an integrated commercial, and more about that later. Then another musical number, and finally the third act in which the situation was resolved. Then a third commercial, followed by a denouement between Fibber McGee and Molly, with Molly finally wishing everyone good night to all. What added to the complexity of the narrative formula was characterization. Fibber McGee himself was a compulsive daydreamer, a schemer, a liar, a fabricator of tall tales, hence the name Fibber. But this outlandishness waned, and within a year he was doing no more impractical daydreaming and scheming than the rest of us. Molly, on the other hand, was always practical, with both feet planted firmly on the ground. Fibber was known for his elocution, or lack thereof. He was known for his long-winded nattering and his clumsy malapropism and botching of common words. But he was also known for his wild, alliterative declarations, such as this one.
Why, when I was a kid, I studied for a long, long time under the famous Professor Ware. Long Underwear McGee, I was known as. That's pretty good, Johnny, but... Long Underwear McGee, the mighty mucky-muck of the metronome, making mugs, the mediocre musical mucks muddling through a mess of monotonous medleys, making millions marvel at the minor melodies made into magnificent masterpieces by the miraculous movements of my magic mitt, miffing many a maestro as I modulated from march militaire into minuets in G, and that's the story of Long Underwear McGee.
In addition, he was known for his minced oaths, his grumbling when things didn't go quite the way he thought they should. He was fond of grousing, "Aw, shucks," and "Dad rat it," as well as borrowing the Shakespearean epithet pshaw, all indicative of his impatience. The patient one was Molly, who was also sensible, and yet she had a linguistic flair all her own. She frequently advised her husband that his latest scheme was no more practical than a square egg, that it was as original as spreading butter on bread, and that it would make as much money as selling subscriptions of censored editions of National Geographic. Out of all this clever rapport came catchphrases that were echoed in our culture during the 1930s and 1940s and even beyond. From Molly came heavenly days when exasperated, and when responding to McGee's self-proclaimed cleverness, she'd groan, "'Tain't funny, McGee." Other catchphrases included "I betcha," uttered by Teeny, an obnoxious brat that lived next door to the McGees, and McGee's "How's every little thing, Mert?" a question asked of the telephone operator, named Mert, who was never heard. It was a simple, one-sided conversation. Two other catchphrases were spoken by secondary characters. Haughty neighbor and McGee's primary sparring partner, Throckmorton P. Gildersleeve, retorted after a session with McGee, "You're a hard man, McGee." Next was the old-timer, who for whatever reason called McGee Johnny and Molly daughter, would intone after hearing McGee's story,
That's pretty good, Johnny, but that ain't the way I heard it.
And this brings us to a major component of the success of the Fibber McGee and Molly series, the friends and acquaintances of the McGees. They themselves were eccentrics, and stopped by the residence or were met on the street in every episode. One such character was known only as Mr. Old-Timer. This oddball was played by a versatile dialectician named Bill Thompson. More about him later. But he was joined by some of radio's finest voice actors. Gale Gordon as Mayor Latrivia, as well as the weatherman F. Ogden Williams, who'd greet McGee with, "Good day, probably." Isabel Randolph as the haughty society matron, Mrs. Abigail Uppington, called Uppy by McGee. Harold Peary as the already mentioned windbag, Throckmorton P. Gildersleeve. Arthur Q. Bryan as Doc Gamble, and it should be noted here that Bryan at the time was also portraying a major Hollywood motion picture star in his own right, Mr. Elmer Fudd.
Greetings.
Also in supporting roles were Shirley Mitchell as the man-crazy war worker, the Rosie the Riveter type, named Alice Darling. Marlon Hurt as Beulah, the maid and cook, and more about Mr. Hurt and Beulah later. B. Benaderet and Elvia Allman as two additional society matrons, Mrs. Millicent Carstairs and Mrs. Clammer, respectively. These are but a few of the great performers who supported the Jordans.
It needs to be said that another great dialectician on the program was Marion Jordan. She was adept at portraying children, and one in particular was, as we noted, Teeny, a precocious little brat who'd consistently interrupt McGee with all manner of questions as he was focused on an activity. She worked I betcha into every conversation, and when McGee explained anything to her, she'd reply, "I know it."
But the most versatile member of the cast was Bill Thompson. He played 4 characters: the old-timer, a Greek restaurateur named Nick DePopulis, a con man with a penchant for drink named Horatio K. Boomer, who sounded very much like W.C. Fields,
and a check for short beer. Well, imagine that, no ID card.
And the hen-pecked, timid bird-watcher Wallace Wimple.
My big old wife, Sweetie Face, doesn't like me to read my bird book, and I'm a bird watcher, you know.
Thompson, it was said, was conversant in 19 languages. In addition to performing on radio, he was a favorite of cartoons, creating character voices for many Disney figures. But perhaps his most recognizable cartoon voice was the same he used for Wallace Wimple.
You know what? I'm happy. Hooray.
In this group shot from around 1940, we find the major players of the Fibber, McGee, and Molly program. We see Arthur Q. Bryan, Harold Peary. Next is Billy Mills, the orchestra leader most associated with the series. Next to him are the Kingsmen, the singing group also most associated with the program, and whose musical numbers just suddenly appear between acts without introduction or comment. Next is Frank Pittman, sound effects and later director of the series, and Gale Gordon. Announcer Harlow Wilcox, Jim and Marion Jordan, and Don Quinn, the program's primary writer, and again, Bill Thompson. The story of Fibber, McGee, and Molly originates with these 3 people, Jim and Marion Jordan and Don Quinn. And it all started in Peoria, Illinois, during those halcyon days of vaudeville. Jim Jordan met Marion Driscoll in the choir at St. John's Church in Peoria. Both were singers, with Marion adept at the piano. Both wanted to perform. They were married on August 13th, 1918, and remained a loving couple for almost 43 years. After a humble start, they eventually joined the vaudeville circuit as singers. The Jordans got their first radio break singing commercials on WIBO in Chicago in 1925. This led to starring roles in Chicago's WENR in the comedic serial The Smith Family, a series that some historians consider the progenitor of the soap opera.
Raymond William Stedman noted in his groundbreaking volume The Serials that
the action, though slapstick, concerned home and family. In a way, the listener was eavesdropping upon something happening in someone else's home at that very moment, listening to people he could expect to meet again and again. The Smith family had its place in the soap opera's family tree, if only as a stunted root.
It was while working at WENR that the Jordans met this man, a former cartoonist turned writer, and immediate friendship developed, and together they formed both a professional and personal relationship that lasted their lifetimes. His name was Don Quinn, and with the Jordans in 1931, he created for WMAQ in Chicago the program Smack Out, a reworking of a previous and short-lived series with the Jordans called Luke and Mirandy. Smack Out was the story of Luke Gray, a storekeeper with a penchant for tall tales and poor business practices. He was always smack out of just about everything, hence the title. Smack Out was in the humorous tradition of Mark Twain, what Gerald Nachman and Raised on Radio called a cracker barrel yarn spinner. Marion demonstrated her talent for vocal characterizations, particularly for the characterization of little children. The mixed success of Smack Out drew the attention of Henrietta Johnson Lewis, daughter of H.F. Johnson, heir to and then running the Johnson Wax Company, and wife of Jack Lewis, partner in the advertising agency Needham, Lewis, and Brorby. Johnson Wax was seeking a new radio series to sponsor, and Henrietta suggested that her husband take a listen. Suddenly, the Jordans and Don Quinn had a show.
The Johnson Wax Program with Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly.
With sponsorship by Johnson Wax, an amiable and productive relationship that would last for 15 years, the creative talent went about crafting a show that was rather unlike any other show, as we have noted. Don Quinn created the characters of Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly, and together all three created and developed the unique format of the show, which, considering their origins in vaudeville, borrowed heavily from the reviews of that earlier period. As radio historian Jim Cox noted in The Great Radio Sitcoms,
from the late 1930s to 1953, Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly followed a triple-segmented format, integrating music, commercials, and comedy, that was so reminiscent of the vaudeville showcases from which its performers emanated.
What Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly did was combine three rather disparate elements into a unified whole, that is, combining music, comedy, and even commercials into a good time.
Commercials? Did you say commercials?
Yes, I did, but more about that later. Of course, the program emphasized humor. Humor affected through verbal wit and oral suggestion. But to complete a good time, let there be music and singing. And perhaps because both Jim and Marion started out as singers, they made certain that music was a dynamic force of their program. To this end, they chose in 1938 band leader Billy Mills to supervise the music, and he brought a lot of swing to the otherwise rather sweet melodies of his predecessors. Mills also wrote the 1940s theme song, Wing to Wing, which opened and closed each episode. It was said that Spike Jones had been a one-time member of the Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly Band. To bring song to the program, the Jordans selected the King's Men, a quartet consisting of Bud Lynn, John Dodson, Rad Robinson, and led by Ken Darby, who would go on to establish the Ken Darby Singers and arrange and lead choral music for Disney and other studios. Often, as we have noted, the music numbers appeared out of nowhere, as if the King's Men were strolling minstrels roaming the streets of Wistful Vista and just happened to stop by 79 Wistful Vista when we were tuned in. Of special significance to the show's effect, in addition to the visitations by the recurring eccentrics, a sort of Allen's Alley in reverse, was what is called the running gag. That is, the show ran away with it. As it states, The running gag was a recurring comedic element that elicited audience anticipation. In other words, we're going to hear it again and again in subsequent episodes. One of those recurring gags delighted both the audience and the sponsor. It was the integrated commercial. That is, the middle commercial was integrated into the storyline, effectively creating a narrative without interruption. Not certain of the origin for this clever narrative element, but the one most identified with it was Jack Benny, and we know that he was using the integrated commercial before the Mcgees used it. And it should be said that the integrated commercial was best suited to the comedy shows. Having the Shadow's caper interrupted by Margot Lane, espousing the virtues of blue coal for heating homes, didn't quite have the same effect. The integrated commercial brought the announcer into the narrative. In the case of Fibber, Mcgee, and Molly, announcer Harlow Wilcox, like his fellow travelers in Wistful Vista, would make an appearance. Halfway through the storyline, Wilcox, called Harpo or Junior or Waxy or Milky by Mcgee depending on who was sponsoring the program, would just suddenly appear. The straight line would come from Mcgee or Molly, such as Molly asking why Mr. Wilcox had such a bright shine on his face. This would lead to Wilcox rambling about... Well, let's take a listen.
These long train rides. Hey, I thought I heard a familiar laugh across the aisle there.
Oh, it's Mr. Wilcox. Yoo-hoo, Mr. Wilcox.
Well, hello, Molly. Hi, Fibber.
What you doing on this train, Harlow?
Oh, just riding back and forth.
Riding back and forth. Aren't you going anyplace?
Nope.
At this point, folks, there should be a sound effect of a faint rustling to indicate Johnson wax dealers all over the country pricking up their ears. Well, if you're not going anyplace, Wilcox, why ride on the train?
Well, I'll tell you why. For 6 years now, you've had all the funny stuff on this show.
Huh?
Do I have any jokes? No.
Well, my goodness, Mr. Wilcox.
All I ever say is what a wonderful product Johnson's self-polishing glow coat is for floors and linoleum.
Well?
How it beautifies and protects against dampness, dirt, and wear.
Yes?
How it's so easy to use because it shines as it dries with no rubbing or buffing.
Right.
How it saves hours of housework. And so on and so on and so on.
Well, so what? It's absolutely true, isn't it?
Of course it's true. I mean every word of it. But is it funny? No. It ain't funny, Mcgee.
Well, now, listen, Mr. Wilcox, how on earth will riding on trains help you?
Why, I can mix with all the traveling salesmen and learn a lot of funny stories. That's how.
Ah. Look, Mr. Wilcox, the stories you'll hear from traveling salesmen will only have one effect on your status with this show.
What's that?
You'll be traveling, salesman.
All right. Gee whiz. Here I try to improve myself, to make something of myself. And where do I get? Off at the next station. So long, folks.
George Burns described it this way. No picture could have been funnier than what the listener was seeing. It was Fibber Mcgee's Closet, the second and most famous of the program's running gags. It was a storeroom of limited space, yet capable of storing more miscellany than what a couple could collect in 20 years, and crammed in so tightly against 3 walls and held in check by a single door that it was as fragile and unsound as an unexploded bomb. In spite of George Burns's astute description, Hollywood did an adequate job of depicting Mcgee's Closet. In the 1941 film, Look Who's Laughing, we find Mcgee...
Are you ready?
As soon as I get my hat ready.
Well, hurry up, Molly. This is the most important meeting since I've been president of the Chamber of Commerce. Where's my speech?
In your portfolio.
Yeah, I know, but where's my portfolio? Oh, I know. It's right here in the hall closet.
straighten out that closet one of these days.
And in the 1959 television series, producers wisely offered more suggestion than representation.
Life must be terribly exciting.
You might say I married adventure.
When we get back, I gotta clean out that closet.
So effective was the gag that the mere mention of closet drew anxious anticipation from the audience. The gag was introduced on March 5th, 1940, by soundman Manny Siegel, who used a partial staircase and filled each step with everything from kitchenware, roller skates, and bric-a-brac to bowling pins and empty oil cans, that on cue cascaded down the steps to the studio stage in a cacophony of nonsense. But as outrageous as it was, the gag was an instant hit, if only because audience members could relate to the chaos of having similar storage problems of their own. It was only natural that Hollywood would be interested in one of the all-time most popular programs during the golden age of radio. According to the C.E. Hooper Company, the radio industry's ratings company of record, Fibber, Mcgee and Molly broke all ratings records between October 1944 and February 1945. Previous to that, by 1941, the Mcgees drew more listeners than Jack Benny, Bob Hope, and Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. At the program's peak, 48 million Americans tuned in each week to listen to the misadventures of Fibber McGee and Molly. And so Fibber McGee and Molly went Hollywood. Their first motion picture was This Way, Please in 1937. They joined fellow radio thespian Mary Livingston with Betty Grable and Ned Sparks in a romantic comedy that touted the return of silent heartthrob Charles Buddy Rogers to the screen. Fibber McGee and Molly's roles were strictly secondary, but whose antics were far more clever than those of the leading performers. Critics were not happy with the film, with one reviewer summing up the sentiments of others by stating,
"Radio and screen may complement each other, but in our opinion, radio stars as a rule had better keep to their own métier."
It took 3 years before Fibber McGee and Molly returned to the screen, and this time they fared better by sharing top billing with fellow radio greats Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, as well as a somewhat newcomer to motion pictures, Lucille Ball. Look Who's Laughing was a wartime comedy that included appearances by Harold Peary as Gildersleeve and fellow regulars Isabel Randolph and Harlow Wilcox. The film was released just prior to Pearl Harbor and proved to be just what troubled audiences needed, becoming the studio's top money-maker, next only to Hitchcock's Suspicion. So successful was Look Who's Laughing that RKO rushed a second film into production. Here we go again, also with Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, but this time with radio singer Ginny Simms. Again, the Wistful Vista eccentrics were on hand, including Gail Gordon, Isabel Randolph, and Harold Peary in a major role as the blustery Gildersleeve. And again the film garnered top hit status for the studio. Such would not be the case for the Jordans' third effort for RKO. Heavenly Days, reflecting Molly's frustrated catchphrase, centered on the Mcgees' trip to Washington on behalf of patriotism. Influenced by Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the film was a hopeless misfire. As one critic noted, audiences preferred Fibber McGee the comedian to Fibber McGee the byword of flag-waving patriotism. The film lost money, and the Mcgees returned to what they did best, radio. The story of Fibber McGee and Molly would be incomplete without mentioning the program's ancillary expressions. Indeed, so pervasive was the radio program that visualizations were not confined solely to the movies. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, the Mcgees regularly appeared in comic strip-style advertisements in what was then referred to as the Sunday funny papers. The strips were like integrated commercials from the radio program, right down to appearances by our man Harlow Wilcox to extol the virtues of Johnson wax. Likewise, similar strips appeared in magazines and featured such characters as Doc Gamble, here rendered in the likeness of Arthur Q. Bryan. And in 1949, Fibber, McGee, and Molly appeared in a one-shot comic book that exaggerated their already exaggerated adventures, all in color for a dime. Of particular interest relative to the history of broadcasting is the notion of spin-off, which is a program derived from some facet, usually a character, of an established series. Some historians claim that Fibber, McGee, and Molly was the first to spin off series, but radio historian Jim Cox has noted that soap operas, especially those of Erna Phillips, had been spun off earlier. But with regard to prime programming, then yes, it can be said that Fibber, McGee, and Molly gave birth to not just one, but two independent programs all their own. The first was in 1941. The Great Gildersleeve featured McGee's favorite adversary, Throckmorton P. Gildersleeve, and the show starred Gildy himself, Harold Peary. The series became a major success in its own right, running, if you include his appearances on Fibber, McGee, and Molly, a total of 18 years. So successful was the series that it garnered 4 films between 1942 and 1944. For unknown reasons, some say salary dispute, others say he grew tired of the role, Peary left the show in 1950 and was replaced by Willard Waterman. Interestingly, Waterman had a bass quality that was nearly identical to Peary's, and Waterman was able to mimic Peary's manner and inflections so that few people knew that Gildersleeve had been replaced by a different actor. The second spin-off came in 1945. The McGee's maid and cook, Beulah, found her own series as The Marlon Hurt and Beulah Show. Known by another catchphrase, "Did somebody bawl for Beulah?" the black female servant was played by a white male, Marlon Hurt, another clever dialectician. The story goes that Hurt stood with his back to the studio audience as one of the characters called for Beulah, at which Hurt would turn, step forward, and respond with the catchphrase, causing the audience to roar with laughter. As we can see in this newspaper advertisement, Hurt not only portrayed Beulah, but her boyfriend and himself. When Hurt died of a heart attack at age 46, another white male took the role, one Bob Corley. The series was then titled The Beulah Show. Corley left the series after a brief effort, and producers wisely hired a black female, namely Hattie McDaniel, the first black entertainer taking a leading role in radio. McDaniel lasted until health problems forced her to retire in 1952. She was replaced by Lillian Randolph. After one season, she left the program and was replaced by her sister, Amanda, who was also appearing at the time as Mama in the Amos and Andy television show. Finally, a word about television. In 1950, the Jordans toyed with the idea of converting their series into a television show. Johnson Wax was eager to do just that, but in the end the Jordans preferred their oral medium to the visual shenanigans of television. Johnson Wax, however, saw the future in television and withdrew sponsorship of the radio series in 1950, ending a 15-year relationship. Into the breach came Pet Milk, and for the next 2 years, Fibber, McGee, and Molly continued their adventures in Wistful Vista on radio, with Harlow Wilcox, now called Milky by Fibber, hawking evaporated milk. But nearly 10 years later, the Mcgees came to television, albeit without the Jordans. Any resemblance to the radio program was pretty much limited to the character names, although Bob Sweeney as Fibber did an admirable job of imitating the mannerisms of Jim Jordan. But both critics and audiences believed that Fibber McGee and Molly without Jim and Marion Jordan was not Fibber McGee and Molly. As one observer noted, had the show been titled something other than Fibber McGee and Molly, it might have been successful. The eccentric McGee and his loving wife left the airwaves on March 23, 1956, following roughly a year of Fibber McGee and Molly Light. That is, because of Marion Jordan's health problems and production cuts by NBC, Fibber McGee and Molly were reduced to 15-minute programs recorded in a studio without an audience, but with Bill Thompson and Arthur Q. Bryan adding to the fun. The Jordans alone, however, found new life as Fibber McGee and Molly in 1957 in a series of 5-minute sketches for NBC's experimental series Monitor. Hosted by Dave Garroway, the Jordans, as Fibber McGee and Molly, shared what the producers described as the comedy vignettes with satirists Bob and Ray. In 1959, NBC offered the Jordans an additional 2 years with Monitor, but the couple declined the offer. That year, Marion was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, forcing the couple into retirement. The dreaded disease would take her on April 7, 1961. Jim Jordan would die April 1, 1988. And so our visit to 79 Wistful Vista comes to an end. But we trust that the antics of Fibber McGee and Molly will live on in our cultural heritage as one of the greats of radio comedy. More important, Fibber McGee and Molly live in our hearts. For never was a diversion so amusing and downright funny than Fibber McGee and Molly. A show that was not only funny, but just plain fun.
That's pretty good, Johnny, but that ain't the way I heard it.
No matter what the time or place, you always meet some smarty face who knows what score is made before the game is played. He knows the inside out and what the world is all about. There's always one around, and here's the way to sound. California has no rains. You can't tip porters on the trains. This program takes a lot of brains.
That ain't the way I heard it.
That old fuddy-duddy.
Burglars dearly love a cop. A kid just hates a lollipop. Hell's a poppin', it's a flop. That's certainly not the way I heard it.
How did you hear it, Mrs. Uppington?
Social leaders hate to be objects of publicity. From all photographers we flee.
But that ain't the way I heard it.
Sweet and low, Donald.
Billy Mills, our maestro, wrote this little ditty, note for note. He thinks he'll get Cole Porter's goat.
That's not the way I'm hearing it.
Have the Greeks got a word for it, Nick?
Sure, a wrestling man just hates to grunt. No Greek will run a restaurant. Cursing never saw the front.
But that ain't the way I heard it. There's a catch in this one, folks.
The world is full of and such from folks who and too much. But nary a drop will I touch.
But that ain't the way I heard it. The way I heard it, I'm known, I guess, from coast to coast as one who never bragged nor boast. Of modest guys, I am the most.
But that ain't the way I heard it.